So today our topic is Reformed epistemology. And Reformed epistemology concerns the question, is it rational to believe that God exists? This also has implications for whether we could know that God exists, because if it's not rational to believe that God exists, then we probably could not know that God existed either. So today we're going to focus on the question about the rationality of believing whether God exists, but know that this also will tell us something about whether we could ever know that God existed. So some people might say, no, it's not rational to believe that God exists. And here's an argument that they could make. So premise one says that rational theistic belief requires a good argument. And theistic belief just means belief that God exists. So if you believe in God, that requires a good argument for it to be rational. But there's no good argument for theism. There's no good argument that God exists. So theistic belief is irrational. It's irrational to believe that God exists. And you might think, well, maybe we should reply to this argument by denying premise two. There's a number of arguments for theism, the ontological argument, cosmological argument, fine-tuning argument. And so someone could say, no, there is a good argument for theism. But the problem is these arguments are very controversial. And then the rationality of theism just kind of hangs on whether these arguments are successful or not. And philosophers have been debating about them for a very long time. A lot of people that believe in God aren't aware of these arguments. And so some people think denying premise two actually isn't the best way to resist this argument. And there's several ways to deny premise one, but we're going to focus on one today, and that's called Reformed epistemology. So Reformed epistemology says that you could be rational to believe that God exists even without a good argument. All right, so to see how Reformed epistemology denies this premise, let's consider 4 different types of beliefs. So your beliefs can be irrational, or they can be rational. Your beliefs can also be based on an argument, and this is what's called a non-basic belief. It's based on something else. It's not basic. It's not a starting point. And then there's also basic beliefs, and these are beliefs that are not based on an argument. So some of our beliefs that are based on arguments are irrational, especially if they're based on bad arguments. So just because it's based on an argument doesn't mean it's rational. But some of our beliefs based on arguments are rational. So if you're meeting with your financial advisor and your financial advisor says, look, this company's been growing a lot and doing very, very well. Here's a bunch of evidence for that. And if this company has been growing a lot and doing very, very well, then you should invest in them. And based on that, you believe I should invest in that company. That's a rational belief, and it's based on this argument. And the argument appeals to the fact that the company's been growing a lot. So some of our rational beliefs are based on arguments. Now let's consider our beliefs that are not based on arguments. So some of these beliefs are irrational. So if you consider someone who, let's say, they have a very strong stance on the abortion debate, they're either very, very strongly pro-life or very, very strongly pro-choice. I think the example would work either way. But if you ask them why, they can't give you any arguments for their position. That, at least in some cases, would seem irrational. It seems when it comes to something like abortion, if you have a strong stance, then you should be able to give an argument for your position. Okay, so the final category is the one that's going to concern us the most today. And this is rational beliefs that are not based on arguments. And this is what's called properly basic beliefs. So they're basic beliefs, they're not based on arguments, but they're proper, they're rational. So what we're going to explore is the question, first we'll start with the question, could any belief be properly basic? Could it ever be rational to believe something if it's not based on an argument? So why think that there are any properly basic beliefs? Let's start with an example. So suppose you believe that it's raining. If all rational beliefs are based on arguments, so there's no properly basic beliefs, then for your belief that it's raining to be rational, you'd have to give me an argument that it's raining. So you might say, well, premise one, I see water falling from the sky. Premise two, if I see water falling from the sky, then it's raining. So conclusion, it's raining. Okay, cool. So you've given me an argument. But now notice your argument has two premises, premise 1 and premise 2. So in order to be rational in believing those premises, you're going to have to give me two new arguments, one for each premise. Because remember, we said you can't have a rational belief unless it's based on an argument. And then so you're going to have now, in addition to the argument on the screen, two additional arguments. But then what you're going to have to do is give me even more arguments to justify the premises of those arguments, and on and on and on. It's just going to get exhausting, and it's going to be really difficult to justify any of your beliefs. And so this is one reason to think that not all of our beliefs have to be justified by arguments. You could have a rational belief even if you can't give an argument for it. In other words, it's because you have to start somewhere, right? You can't just continually give arguments and arguments and arguments. It's just going to be basically impossible. Okay, so what are some examples of some beliefs that might be properly basic? I have a couple here. So I believe I'm in pain. You could rationally believe that even if you can't give an argument for it, because you just immediately perceive that pain. I believe there's a tree. You see the tree. You don't have to give me an argument. You don't have to have an argument that there's a tree. You just see it. I believe that is my mother. You recognize your mother and you believe that's your mother. That's rational. You don't need an argument. I believe she's happy. You just perceive that emotion when you see someone. You don't have to give an argument. I believe I had eggs for breakfast. Again, you're relying on your memory. You don't have to give me an argument. And two kind of clarifications about properly basic beliefs. So a belief might be based on something, like a feeling or a seeming or a perception. You know, you feel pain, or it seems to you that she's happy, or you perceive a tree. That doesn't mean that belief is based on an argument, but that other thing the belief is based on can still give you justification. That can still contribute to the fact that that belief is rational. So just because a belief is basic doesn't mean it's based on nothing or you don't have a good reason for it. It just means it's not based on an argument. Also, being properly basic doesn't mean it would be impossible for you to provide an argument for it. So maybe if you really thought about it, you could give me an argument. There's a tree, you know, my perception is reliable. If my perception is reliable and I see a tree, you know, there's a tree there, and I see a tree, so there's a tree there, you know. But just because you can provide an argument for it doesn't mean that your initial belief was based on that argument. You probably just saw the tree and formed the belief, right? So it doesn't mean being properly basic doesn't mean you could never give an argument. It just means the belief isn't based on an argument. And what's interesting to think about is many of your beliefs probably actually aren't based on arguments. I mean, I'm sure some are, but a lot of just the things we perceive or remember when we recognize other people or perceive their emotions, a lot of times we just kind of form that belief immediately, and it's not based on, you know, these premises and a conclusion. Okay, so now we've sort of talked about what is a properly basic belief and talked about some reasons to think that some beliefs are properly basic. And this leads us to the main thesis of Reformed epistemology. And Reformed epistemology is the view that belief in God, belief that God exists, can be properly basic. So it can be rational, even if it's not based on an argument. And people that argue for Reformed epistemology, Alvin Plantinga being one of the main defenders of this view, they argue that we don't need to argue our way up to theism in order to justify believing in God. You don't have to have an argument that God exists in order for belief that God exists to be rational. So I'm going to give some reasons to think this in a second, but I actually want to start off with, I think, what is one of the most common objections, and then sort of show how defenders get around this objection. So here's the objection. The objection says, well, look, if belief in God can be rational without an argument, couldn't we use similar reasoning to justify lots of beliefs that are just clearly irrational, like, you know, belief in the flying spaghetti monster, or, you know, things that we clearly consider irrational today that, like, when it's, you know, storming, the gods are angry at us. Like, wouldn't this just make way too many beliefs rational? And the response to this is, well, look, simply because you don't need an argument for belief in God doesn't mean you can just believe whatever you want. It doesn't mean that anything is justified. Other things might be required for a belief to be rational, even if not an argument, like we sort of talked about already. And this is going to depend on your theory of justification. But you might have seemings, reasons, or perceptions that aren't arguments, but nonetheless provide evidence. So the fact that you perceive a tree is evidence that there is a tree, even if that's not an argument. Might also be that the belief is rational because it's produced by a properly functioning part of your mind. So when your vision is functioning properly and you see a tree, then some people think that belief is rational because the part of your mind that produces the belief that there's a tree, because it's working properly. When you hallucinate, something's going wrong. There's some kind of improper function. So that's why beliefs in things you would hallucinate aren't rational. Or similarly, the belief is produced by a reliable process. It's produced by a process that's likely to give you true beliefs, and that's why it's rational. So these are ways that a belief could be rational without providing an argument. And especially along the lines of these last two ideas, that beliefs are rational when they're produced by a properly functioning part of your mind or a reliable process, some defenders of the view that belief in God can be properly basic have argued for what's called a sensus divinitatis. So Augustine, Calvin, and Plantinga are all people that have argued for this. And what they argue is that there's a special part of our minds, and this is responsible for producing beliefs about God. So think about when you go into nature and see its beauty. You might be inclined to believe there's a creator, and Augustine, Calvin, and Plantinga say that this is because your sensus divinitatis is producing that belief. When you do something wrong and you feel guilty about it, you might be inclined to ask God for forgiveness. Or if you're in danger, you might ask God for help. So these are all examples of what they think is a sensus divinitatis that is responsible for producing these beliefs, that God exists, or that I should ask God for forgiveness, or God created everything, or God is powerful, those kinds of things. So if you have a sensus divinitatis that reliably produces these beliefs about God, this gives us good reason to think that the belief that God exists can be properly basic. It can be rational without an argument. Well, why think that? Well, I think it helps to think about other belief-forming processes like memory or perception. So if your memory or perception are normally reliable and they're functioning the way they're supposed to, then they'll produce rational beliefs like there is my mom or I had eggs for breakfast. These beliefs don't have to be based on an argument, but they're produced by these reliable, properly functioning processes. So similarly, if your sensus divinitatis is reliable and working properly, you could rationally believe that God exists, even if this belief isn't based on an argument. All right, so what we have covered today, we've covered an argument that religious belief is irrational. We've talked about a couple different kinds of beliefs, non-basic, basic, and properly basic, where properly basic beliefs are rational beliefs that aren't based on an argument. And then we looked at some reasons to think that there can be rational beliefs that aren't based on an argument. There can be properly basic beliefs. And then we've also looked at reasons to think that belief in God, belief that God exists, could be properly basic. And this is the main thesis of Reformed epistemology. And then we've considered an objection to Reformed epistemology. Couldn't this justify a bunch of other beliefs? And we've said no, because if the sensus divinitatis is functioning properly, we can explain why the belief in God is rational, but there isn't a similar kind of faculty that would justify these other beliefs. So just because belief in God is properly basic doesn't mean that anything goes.